Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kaligan and another phenomenal guest today. It is the final episode we're recording here, January 2023. We're hot off a big debate, a bit unexpected and last minute with Haas, Infrared Haas, the MAGA communists. And today we are joined by Momcilo Noveski, a friend of mine and a content creator who's done some good work against this stuff. He'll introduce himself in a second. Dmitry, how are you?
I'm doing very well. It's again, it's been a super eventful week, and even we've been very active on Twitter Spaces as well as some of the content we've been releasing on Substack. So make sure to check that out. Yeah, just super active everywhere, and of course, this episode is packed with information for you guys. So just sit tight, enjoy, put on your comfortable headset, and you just relax and kind of take it all in.
Oh yeah, my name is Momcilo. I have YouTube videos that I make on my channel called Momcilo Noveski. Also, I write for on my friend's Substack as well. I have some articles there.
Yeah, we'll have all the links to those. He's got some great video, a really great video against Haas. That's probably the best made, like not live stream, just like pre-made content on the subject matter on YouTube, I would say right now, as well as some good articles with his buddy Zoltanis on the subject. But yeah, if you couldn't tell already, this is going to be this first part of the show. We're going to talk about the news. We'll have it timestamped below for those that want to hear that first. But now we're going to be getting into kind of our foray into the debate sphere against, it's a bit of a broad spectrum, but the MAGA communists, the quote-unquote based communists, the Infrared Collective, as their YouTube and Twitter handles all say. This group of people online that believe that communism is the number one thing you can do, that the number one belief that you can adopt to fight globalism and to be based and preserve tradition of all things. And we, of course, as Orthodox Christians, think that is extremely silly. And we had a debate. It was on Twitter Spaces. We'll have some of this linked below. It got heated at some points. There was a lot of controversial things discussed, but I thought it was very interesting. And I think, frankly, we did a pretty good job articulating our position, the three of us here. So I don't know who wants to go first. Maybe I'll let Dmitry talk for a few minutes, and then Momcilo, kind of let us know where you think, kind of where you encountered Haas first and where you kind of think he's gone wrong.
I suppose I'll just ease everybody into the conversation in terms of listeners. So essentially, a couple days ago, myself, Conrad, and Momcilo, we all participated in a more or less a discussion with a new phenomenon of content creator, at least online in the political sphere. It's what you would call a MAGA communist. And some of you may think, well, what would constitute MAGA communism? And essentially, we'll be discussing that for the next hour or so here on this podcast. And so we had a discussion with this MAGA communist named Infrared Haas. So Haas is probably one of the foremost, I would say, ideologues of this particular new movement they have online. And this particular branch of communism, or this deviation of communism, it would take a more conservative leaning, and so essentially we were discussing with him what would be the particular, I guess, intersections. Where would MAGA communism and Orthodox Christianity, or at least the Orthodox Christian worldview, which myself, Conrad, and Momcilo all espouse, how would that differ? Where would that maybe intersect? But mostly the differences, and exactly why maybe the views of the World War Now hosts would maybe be against some of the positions of the MAGA communists, which, apparently they're gaining steam online, especially in the Twitter sphere. So that was the crux of the discussion. Now, it is online. The discussion went for about 2.5 hours. So as you can imagine, we did get stuck in a few details, and we were kind of churning through, and it did get quite heated by the end, but we did get through some pretty key issues, and we came to some pretty interesting revelations about exactly what MAGA communism is, and here we are to discuss that.
So my history with Haas, so my friend that I write the Substack with, Zoltanis, he had debated him some years ago, basically trying to, when he kind of was a lot smaller, I guess you could say, and he was trying to say, like, oh, look, we have a lot more in common than you think, or maybe we could do something here, and Haas was like, no, we can't do this. He was trying to create like a sort of a common allies, are saying, we should stop trying to attack us, the more sort of nationalistic side of things, instead of just focus on liberalism or whatever. And so then a year later after that debate, I saw that he was calling himself a conservative or a traditionalist. He says that communists are actually the most conservative and the most traditionalist of all people currently alive now. But this is also the guy who says that he's a mecha tanky, and also the guy who's claimed that he's a Stalinist libertarian. So I don't know how he squares those, but I'll leave that there. And then so I saw some of his videos that he produced, him and the Infrared Collective, as they call themselves. And Bahaz is like the guy who basically runs it. And he's the sort of personality behind it all, very personality driven. And oh yes, I watched some of his videos. And then I saw that this is not what Marxism is actually about, like not actually what Marx, Engels, Lenin, the actual sort of theoreticians of Marxism were about. And I saw how much deviated from actual like Marxism, I guess you could say. And so I did, I guess, an critique of his ideology. Both there's an article that we have written called "Communism is Not Conservative." That is really in depth, and there's like a lot of quotes like towards the end, just sort of about all the way that Marx, Engels, Lenin, all primary sources about how they viewed religion and how they viewed nationalism and how they viewed like sort of these non-class collectivist identities, and they're very hostile towards it. And then as well, I made another video basically debunking some of his videos, going line by line, showing that as well.
No, we're going to be sure to link all those below. They're really good reads, good watches, but that's a good place to start, I think. Momcilo, Haas made a lot of claims. He briefly referenced Ganon. Of course, his metaphysics were obviously the most lacking part of his kind of side of the debate. It was made pretty clear to the audience, and I'm not even saying that to dig at him. He is admittedly not as well educated and read on either Orthodoxy or even a lot of Muslim metaphysics in his own admission. But when it comes to his kind of citing of these random figures, talking about the appreciation for the sublime and how communism actually supposedly is able to preserve the key essence of religion, I think it's key. He made that distinction, and we referenced his friend who had been speaking earlier, had a very humanistic perspective on religion. Momcilo, where do you think they're going wrong there, and how do you think they're directly contradicting communism?
Sure. So I just want to say I'm not a communist. I'm going to sort of critique, but I'm going to critique them for what I think is the actual communist perspective to show their internal, how they're not internally consistent. But I just want to make clear I'm not an actual communist. So if you actually look what people like Marx said about religion, people like Engels said about religion, even people like Lenin said about religion. For instance, Lenin in his this 1905 pamphlet, I believe it's called Christianity and Socialism. He says that religion is this sort of parochial that's holding down the peasant and the proletariat from developing this class consciousness, and he recommends actually that the party members or that the Bolsheviks at that time, or the Communist Party in Russia at the time, that they give the workers atheistic material from France, like Enlightenment atheistic material. These are his words. They give them these pamphlets and whatnot so that they don't have the religion, so it's much easier to develop a sort of class consciousness. And then, as well as their view of religion. So Haas tries to, in the infrared in general, they try to say that, communism is compatible with, Christianity with religion. However, if you see the way that these actual Marxist theoreticians talk about religion, the very best that you'll get is maybe a humanistic understanding of religion, where they'll say that, oh yes, religion is beautiful. You get these beautiful cathedrals, these beautiful traditions, these beautiful churches, all the beautiful rituals, all this stuff. However, this is all humans made this, and it's all a human design. Isn't it so beautiful that humans were able to make this, right? So they make it very humanistic. They don't understand that, no, this religion that we have, we didn't make it, right? It's like God gave it to us, and we just sort of participate in this reality. So that's like really the best that you're going to get. And then with regards to, I can go more just talking about the various contradictions that they make. But yeah, these theorists, Marx, Engels, Lenin, etc., they were not whatsoever in favor of nationalism or any sort of traditionalism. In fact, they want to overturn tradition. Marx in the Communist Manifesto, he has that famous line saying that all that is sacred is profaned, all that is solid melts into air. And I would somewhat agree, and that's Marx talking about capitalism. I would actually agree with Marx about that's what capitalism does. However, when Marx writes that, he's very giddy about that, because he then talks later how you can actually then use that, because capitalism is destroying all tradition, making everything solid into air, making everything sacred profane. Communists are then able to come in, and through their dialectic, they're able then to advance us to the next stage of history due to capitalism, making everything. Just kind of destroying all the old structures, and then they're able to come in with their with their Marxism, with their communism. So they say that very giddily. They're very happy to say that. Whereas we, of course, we would agree that capitalism does that. However, we think this is one of the bad things about capitalism, but they view that as one of the good things of capitalism. However, it seems like Haas doesn't really take that up. He doesn't take up that actual like sort of orthodox Marxist line of reasoning up. He says, oh no, actually we can have communist conservatism. And one thing that they do, which is very you see this what they do. For instance, if you bring up to them Marx, Engels, and what they viewed about religion, Haas will say, and I've seen him say this before, I heard him say this before when I brought this up to him in some of my interactions with him. He's like, oh yes, I agree that Marx and Engels are wrong about religion here, that they had a very immature, not fully developed view. But however, when we look at communism in actuality, what we see is that they do have this sort of respect for religion. So even if that is true, which I think historically that's not really the case, you look at the iconoclasm of Mao, you look at what happened, all the new martyrs of the Soviet from the Soviet era, and all these things. I don't think that's historically true. But even if for the sake of argument, if it's historically true, ideologically, it seems like Haas has no way to ground what communism actually is. He doesn't, because communism is whatever communists do. So it becomes the circular definition of communism is just whatever people who describe themselves as communists do. However, he only does that to people that he likes. So, for instance, he doesn't think Khrushchev, who called himself a communist, who was a part of the Communist Party, was the premier of the Communist Party, and led the Soviet Union, he would not be considered a communist, even though he is a subscribed communist doing. However, for some reason, he doesn't that as real communism. Or when he looks towards the West, and he sees the sort of stereotypical image of the sort of blue-haired, nose-piercing communist or self-described communist, he will also not view them as real communist because that's not because he doesn't like them, right? Because he doesn't, it's bad aesthetics, it's not what real communism is. So he really has no way to ground his definition of communism or Marxism. And even if you read some of his Substack articles, he talks about for instance, he talks about Maoism. There's this idea of the infinity within it, this idea of the infinite. It can be anything and everything. So there seems to be no real grounding to what his actual communism is. And whenever you point out things in Marx that he doesn't like, he says, oh, well, we communists, we real communists, as we've seen in actuality, have developed past that, and we've seen what real communism actually is. So there's no means of grounding anything that he's talking about whatsoever.
Much like how he tried to slander us by citing the deficiencies of perhaps our Peter the Great. We were unlike him. He's like, oh, that wasn't real communist to me. He was the real czar. He may have made some mistakes, but it was still glorious. He tried to bring all that up with us. But Dimitri, I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, so essentially what I'm hearing you say, Momcilo, is at the end of the day, the authority on communism seems to be actually the actual, ideologues of this particular branch of communism itself. So it seems like in some ways, Haas himself and Jason Hinkle, to name just two of the movers of the particular movement in particular, they do become the new, reviewers of truth, and they are the new censors who enable exactly what comes into their movement. And at this point in time, it does seem like they are removing the need for atheism, which made itself, familiar to all communist movements around the world. So as you said, almost all communist movements historically have been atheistic, and by all I mean over the 20th century, those movements which actually came to power in Romania, in Serbia, in Russia, in China, as well as I'm sure in North Korea and Cuba, have all essentially been theoretically somewhat pure in the Marxist sense that they would go against religion and go against some of these things they would actually ascribe as to corrupt religions which were corrupted by capitalism, which was one of the talking points in the debate actually, where he mentioned that, hey, your Orthodox Christian church as well was corrupted by capitalism in its own sense. And he did kind of allude to that, but more so in his written text. But in the debate, it did come up that, hey, even the church was somewhat corrupted by capitalism, so it needed to be cleansed by, the flames of communism, which I think is slightly absurd and very sacrilegious, shall we say. But nevertheless, he did kind of push that angle just slightly on us. And I would say that it does seem like, Infrared as well as Jackson Hinkle, some of these movers, as you mentioned, they are the last line. So they are the popes of the religion. They do determine what goes into Maga communism, and whatever somebody from the left, for example, a Hassan Pike or any of these leftist Marxists say, they claim, well, LGBTQ rights are an essential sort of tenet and element of Marxism. But for MAGA communists, no. Jackson Hinkle and in particular Haas, they confirmed that no, as the leaders of the movement, they will not let that particular element enter into their version of communism. So yeah, at the end of the day, it does seem like they are the new Lenins and Stalins of this particular branch, and while also rejecting what their forefathers, what their predecessors preached quite vehemently, especially on the part of Lenin, preached militant atheism, and they even have the audacity to claim that Lenin and Marx were wrong in those particular instances, and they don't really explain why, besides the fact that, hey, religion had all these positive traits, but many things are positive traits. We can claim as non-Christians, for example, that, hey, LGBTQ traits may be positive to society, as Hassan Parker claims, and some of the pushes of left-wing Marxism. So just wanted to ask you about that, Momcilo, because I think that was the large element of the debate. It was the fact that, hey, communism was anti-religious, kind of from the get-go, and myself and Conrad, we wanted to ask how exactly has tried to avoid this particular conundrum, and it doesn't seem like we received a satisfying answer.
So even in the discussion that we had when we brought up, I forget how exactly it went, but we talked about in the early Soviet Union, like under Lenin, or in the early Stalin period as well, there's a lot of anti-religious sentiment, like the League of Militant Atheists and all these other groups. And Haas admitted to all of this. And he's like, yes, but the way he does it, it's very sneaky what he does, right? Because he says that, he says that the anti-Christian sentiments, the militant atheist sentiments, was only the younger, lower-ranking members of the party. However, when it comes to with Stalin and Lenin, they were against this in actuality, and there was just like this sort of excess of these sort of there's this revolutionary spirit going on, and you just had these young people who were very full of excess. And he says, yes, they went too far, and they shouldn't have done that. But in actuality, Stalin and the party were actually against this. Trust me, bro. And there's no real source for that whatsoever.
No, it's true, and I think, and we tried our best to. This was before it got that heated, to cite the consensus of the church, talk about the royal martyrs and how important canonization is to us. And that brings me to what I want to talk to you about a bit more, Momcilo, and that was kind of what started the discussion. Was one of Haas's kind of sycophants was talking to us and couldn't really keep up, so he had to get Big Brother Haas to come kind of take over, and that's really what started the discussion. And the whole time, Haas failed to present to me a consistent epistemology, whereas we, I think, fairly clearly presented how our claims, even our quote-unquote historical evidence for our authority, also has epistemic weight because of what we would both say presuppositional apologetics and Christian apologetics, as well as the church as a pillar and foundation of truth. And Haas didn't seem to want to accept that at all, despite that we made it very clear. And then we have some of his followers expressing how dialectical materialism and its view of history is more sound of an epistemology than submitting to the Church of Christ, and then all of the consistent philosophical arguments that come with theism and Trinitarianism. So, Momcilo, I'm curious as to what you think about how the dialectical materialist view of history and epistemology, how they can somehow claim that is consistent with a Christian or a traditionalist ethic of any kind.
It's not. And even if you look into, for instance, Lenin's logico-empiricism and material criticism, where it's a very sort of insider debate that he's doing. He's going against Ernst Bloch and other Marxist neo-Kantians that Lenin's going after. And in there, Lenin makes the argument that the mind is material itself. Everything is material, and that there's no need for spirituality or religion because everything is material. And if it's not really worth and then epistemological sort of framework to really work in, that would say is good, because as I said, not only are there problems with authority in the sense where does the authority of the text or the authority of meaning come from with communism, it's really just whatever Haas and the infrared collective say, right? So they have no reason for why Deng Xiaoping, for instance, they like Deng Xiaoping, and they like Xi Jinping, they like the current Chinese government. However, even though the fact that they are very revisionist, so to speak, against Maoism, against aspects of Mao, they'll still use his image in some ways, but you're not really allowed to defend the Great Leap Forward or parts of the Cultural Revolution. You can't really defend those things. In current China, they're very they respect Mao to an extent. However, they are anti-Maoist in essence, and Haas is okay with that. However, when it comes to somebody like Khrushchev, as we talked about, even though Khrushchev and Deng Xiaoping were both against Mao and Stalin respectively. They're not cool with Khrushchev, but they're okay with Deng Xiaoping and the people that come in there afterwards. And then another thing that we saw in the debate was that they had no base. Haas kept talking about, he kept appealing to our Christian sense of the dignity for man. So, as Orthodox Christians, we believe that man is made in the image of God, and therefore there's this inherent dignity in man. But there doesn't, in Marxism, there's no way that they can ground the dignity of man in. There's no way that they can say, oh, yes, man is grounded. Man has dignity because X, Y, Z. They just say man has dignity because man has dignity. And they reduce, there's that famous line in, I think it's the preface to Marx's critique of of Hegel's philosophy of Hegel. And in it, he says, to be radical is to go to the root of things, but for the root of man, it is man. So that's a circular justification for justifying the dignity of man. So yeah, they had really no good epistemology whatsoever, not only with regards to authority, but also just grounding basic things like where do you get the dignity of man from? And then one thing that's very insidious that they do with regards to our Christianity, and especially us who believe in a presuppositional apologetic, is that they say that first we can take Marxism and accept dialectical materialism, and then we can find Christianity, instead of saying that we have to have Christianity before we can find anything else. And that's the most insidious part to me.
No, I completely agree. And in many ways, Haas talked about, from the epistemological perspective, Haas was trying to get on our level and prove how we couldn't prove from our perspective that communism was bad. And this is after ignoring the anathemas, ignoring all the citations of saints that we were posting, I'm posting St. Gabriel of Georgia burning a picture of Lenin. And remember, literally all of this started when Dmitry posted a picture of Lenin with a pentagram on his head saying he was the father of Ukraine, which is true and just straight from Putin. And in that regard, Haas was incapable of even grasping the obvious, like we explained to him ecumenical councils, consensus patrum, and even a few other basic epistemological stopping points within our program, and he refused to accept that and thought that a single citation of an archbishop somewhat being nice towards communism in the Khrushchev era was enough for us to be inconsistent in denouncing communism. I want to hear Dimitri's thoughts on that, and then we'll get back to Momcilo.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing you guys say is that you've probably noticed, and just as I have, that essentially Has was attempting to disprove our stance, whereas he didn't even try to epistemologically ground his particular argument, and so he just kind of said these, kind of floating communist terms as well. He didn't exactly say we pick and choose from different communist theorists, but that's essentially what he implied. He said, well, we're not going to pick and choose atheism, as Momcilo added, and we're just going to pick and choose from these particular communist leaders in China and from Lenin, and we're not going to take Trotsky at all. Notice Trotsky wasn't mentioned, even though he was a huge ideologue of communism in the Soviet Union, so he was completely ignored, and the reasons weren't presented exactly why. Whereas from our perspective, especially Conrad made it very clear that Orthodox epistemology, of course, comes from, we can even succinctly summarize into three sources: the Gospel, Orthodox tradition, and of course through the prism of consensus patrum, exactly what does the majority, or what is the general opinion, the consensus of the church fathers. And this is what we base essentially our epistemology on, and we made that very clear. The ball was in our court, we bounced it back to Haas, and of course we bounced it very well in terms of we were willing to answer any questions regarding our particular way of evidencing and providing sound argumentation, and even to the point where I think we made a few defenses of Russian as well as Byzantine or even Christian theory of politics, especially going into Russian history, some really deep and perhaps even dark details, which we had to flush out because Has began kind of gish galloping and attacking these various points of Orthodox Christian history, especially that of the revolution, and some points about the Romanov dynasty, trying to sort of catch us off guard. Oh, what about this? What about that? Whereas we kind of just wanted to provide clarity for the listeners, because at this point the discussion didn't really devolve into a debate, so to speak, without a moderator. So we were just kind of rebutting and clarifying every single point he was making. And I think that's when we got a little bit caught out, or at least he came into it thinking it was a debate and he needed to gish gallop, provide all of these facts we needed to disprove, whereas his position wasn't even clearly stated. Essentially, he kind of got away with just having this blank assumption that, hey, this is MAGA communism because I say so. And I think we kind of missed the chance to even call him out on it, but it is very clear for listeners, and if people go listen back to the actual tape recording of the entire discourse, that hey, Has actually didn't make it clear why MAGA communism is pro-religion, why it even allows for religion, so they won't find the justification there, and I think any astute listener would kind of make sense of that. So Has actually gave himself a huge disservice, whereas his perspective isn't very clear in the recording as well as in the actual live debate. I don't think the listeners understood exactly why they should trust MAGA communism more than Orthodox Christianity when it came to, say, religious and wholesome conservative politics, because, hey, his position wasn't justified. What was it grounded on besides simply rhetorical statements of sorts?
It seems like, so if you watch some of his videos that he has on YouTube, I haven't watched them in a while, but one thing that he tries to do is says that, communism, and he gives some cherry pick quotations from the sort of founders of Marxism. Communism is supposed to go towards the people like as they are. Like that's one of the things. Like, oh, we're dealing with the people like as they are. We're dealing with their actual material conditions, and so that's I guess like that's one way they're able to sort of say, oh, MAGA communism, or communism can be conservative, but then they don't take the extra step. So while that is true for like one good example you can think of that the communists did was during the sort of like 19th century when they were kind of in their heyday, so to speak, they Marxist groups, so like drinking Marxist groups, right? So they would have both of these things, and they would always have, they would have, Catholic groups, Protestant groups. They'd have all these sort of like front groups that they could have. So we can get the Protestant workers, we can get the Catholic workers, we can get the, the pro-drinking workers, we can get the anti-drinking workers, and they would all do that. But the goal of that, which is the part that Haas leaves out, is so that we can have this sort of total global sort of ideology where those things don't matter anymore, and the only thing that matters is this sort of class consciousness that matters, where there's no more nationalities, there's no more religion, there's no more of these things that sort of that, as the Marxists would directly separate mankind. All those things are totally wiped out. So the purpose of going towards the people as they are is so that you can get rid of those things that you have to appeal to them to, so that way that you only have this sort of massive proletariats who have a collective class consciousness, and they're led by their class consciousness and not led by any religion. And that goes again to this idea that it's insidious, because they say that communism brings us the truth of religion, not that religion brings us the truth of whether or not. So their idea is that we have to have communism first, and then it will tell us if religion is true or not. Not the opposite, which we say is that our religion, Orthodox Christianity, is true due to the impossibility of the contrary, and then this grounds our moral epistemology and allows us to judge everything else from this starting point, which is true due to the impossibility of the contrary and basic presuppositionalism.
No, it's true. And for those that aren't familiar, we recommend looking up David Bahnsen and Jay Dyer's explication of those ideas on. Yeah, David Bahnsen's his son. My bad. You're right. Greg is the one who's no longer with us. But that we ground our epistemology in a lot of their words, and we believe that many of the church fathers and even ancient philosophers were hinting at and making proto versions of presuppositional apologetics back in the day. But in many ways, in backing up our epistemology, we enforced the idea of the catechon and the Third Rome and the institution of the Christian emperor. And Momcilo and others, we appeal to Dugan in many ways, who we know Haas respects, and we have some mutual ground there. We tried to kind of make this clear to him. And and Dimitri explained in many ways like the sacramental nature of this, I don't think we could have made it any clearer that sacramental nature being bridged with our epistemology in the church and our religion, and that was something that was unclear to him, to then understand why the anathemas against communism make it untenable for our position. He, I think, was being willfully ignorant of the pretty basic points we were making, connecting our exegesis there. And so I'm wondering, from either of you, I'll let Dimitri maybe go first, what was Haas kind of missing about Russia specifically and the catechon, and how that wasn't truly fulfilled in the Soviet Union?
Well, I think on the first point regarding the sacredness of the Russian ruler, so the monarch in Russia was not just considered a secular dictator, which he had essentially dictatorial powers that any Western, even the same sort of powers that Stalin would have, maybe even more, technically speaking, because he wasn't bound by any laws until 1905, 1906, when the unfortunate document of the Russian Constitution was drafted by Freemasons, shall we say. But essentially, the Tsar in Russia was not bound essentially by any legal documents, and has kind of implied that, hey, look, well, how do you guys make sense of this? Like, what? And we explained it from the ground up. We said, look, in our epistemology, in our worldview, in our Orthodox Christian tradition, the emperors and tsars are actually not bound by any legal documents. They're not supposed to be. The only thing Orthodox rulers are bound by is Orthodox Church tradition, one, and two, the gospel. So they do have to follow their Orthodox Christian conscience, and this, of course, implies the fact that they actually attend church, and they go to confession, and they actually participate in the life of the church, including, of course, speaking to notable bishops, their own priest confessor, monks, clergy, etc., which, of course, is Symphonia, which we also explained to Has very clearly, kind of from the ground up, because he really didn't understand the fact that, hey, monarchy is an essential element of Orthodoxy, even more so than certain types of vestments. And or it's not even decorative in the fact that it exists in the church. It has existed in the Orthodox Christian tradition prior to the emergence of even the ranks of metropolitans and patriarchs. So the rank of an Orthodox emperor, even some of the traditions around the emperor actually participating and communing in the altar, things of that nature, they have existed from centuries before even the first patriarchs emerged onto the scene. And as Orthodox tradition kind of became more enriched by these, by these additions, such as we've enriched our sort of liturgical tradition in all nations, including the way we sing, the way we put up candles, exactly how long the liturgy would be, as these adjustments were made over time, and of course, in the context of each particular nation, and liturgies were drafted by saints such as Saint John Chrysostom. We made it clear to Haas especially that, hey, look, Orthodox monarchy and the Orthodox monarchist theory kind of it is one and the same. It is part of that tradition. And he really couldn't grasp it. He said, well, the Romanovs must have been some outside thing, like this reverence for the monarchs of Russia, this reverence for the tsars and emperors. Like, surely Peter the Great somehow broke off with all this. And no, we kind of explained it. No, Peter the Great, yes, he made big mistakes. No, he isn't a saint in our church, but he was Orthodox Christian until the end. Not a good Orthodox Christian. Obviously, he's made mistakes. I'm not one to judge, him in particular. So he was an Orthodox Christian until the end, and he had a priest by his bedside as he passed away. So Paz really wasn't aware of this. In fact, I don't think he's read any of the historical documents relating to Peter the Great's time. I think he's kind of gathered his opinion from Alexander Dugan's writings, which Alexander Dugan, we made it very clear that he wasn't a historian either. So Has was basically pushing all these opinions about Russian monarchy onto us, kind of saying, well, can you guys explain this? None of this seems to align with religion or orthodoxy. And we were claiming that, yes, actually, most of these things do align, and almost everything can be explained within our tradition, frankly. And, of course, this was, I think, the main... At least this took up a good portion, maybe 45 to 50 minutes of the discussion of the actual debate, was regarding Russia's history and the role of the monarch in the church, which me and Conrad love speaking about, and we've done a lot of reading and research into it. So this in particular, I think we were very happy to discuss it for hours on end if Haas would allow, but he eventually kind of sidelined because he said, hey, wait, these guys actually know everything from A to Z. How I need to change the subject real quick because I can't catch these guys out on any of these points. And look, I can't actually make a crude comparison between Peter the Great, who communed in the altar, right, when his priest and bishop allowed him, in comparison to maybe a Lenin and a Stalin, like how some crudely compare, say, Peter the Great reformer, so to speak, to Stalin or a Lenin who also reformed society. It's like, okay, these two you cannot compare. And thank God he didn't compare anyone to Ivan the Terrible, who Ivan the Fourth was extremely pious in his life, even more so than Peter, and definitely more orthodox than either Lenin or Stalin. So fortunately that analogy was not made, so we didn't have to go all the way to the 1500s to correct Has. We kind of had to stay in the 1700s onwards. But yeah, there was a lot of historical discussion, and Marxist revisionism was on full display in this debate.
So I don't want to touch too much on like the exact sort of political theology of Russia and like stuff like the political structures, because I'm just not as aware as you guys are, so I'll let you guys speak about that. But I do want to add a couple of things here. So I want to read this quote from, so this is from Dr. Eric Van Ree. He was I guess an intellectual historian of Stalin. Like he went through like what did Stalin himself actually believe. So, and this quote, he talks about before in this quote how he went through the massive personal library of Joseph Stalin, and this is in his book, The Political Thought of Joseph Stalin. And then, so he says this about the library which he went through. So most of these thinkers in the library can be put into the broad category of materialist, socialist, and forerunners of Marxism. Strikingly, the collection of books contained nothing written by Slavophiles, Pan-Slavist, or other Russian conservatives, other than literary figures and historians. For all his admiration, for all Stalin's admiration of Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great, Stalin seems to have been uninterested in the systems of thought that old Russia produced. The library reflects a serious lack of interest in traditions other than Marxism. And then, so Haas tries to paint Stalin as this sort of continuer of like maybe if not like the Tsar, like the exact office of the Tsar, at least maybe the spirit of that, like a sort of a true Russian leader. However, as we really just into like Marxism and socialism and things like that. And then one thing that Haas says that really struck me as really weird is that he tried to argue that Stalin was actually a believing Christian, like a good Christian, even if he didn't go to church or whatnot. He was still a good Christian, citing the fact that he was in a Georgian seminary, even though he dropped out of that, and I think he wrote some poetry in his diary, about Jesus or something like that. And this just seems really. He said the same thing about Marx too. He said that Marx, in some of his really early poetry, he says like, "Oh, like Jesus, I love you," or something like that. And like maybe they did write that. I think they did write that. However, that doesn't mean that later in their life they kept to that. It doesn't mean if you're like 16 years old and you say I love Jesus, that doesn't mean like 20 years down the line that you're still going to have an actual like desire for Jesus or for God or be an actual Christian in the sense that we would use the term. So yeah, so Stalin. And you brought up, Conrad, a good point. It's that the most that Orthodox can give to Stalin is what Patriarch Ilya of Georgia, who could be canonized soon after he passes, is that Stalin may be repentant on his deathbed. Right, that's the most generous that we can be towards Stalin with regards to his Christianity. And then I want to touch on a little bit about Haas and his relationship with Alexander Dugan. So I've had several of my like actual works published by Dugan on his Facebook page, and other of his people have translated my work from his stuff and whatnot. And what Haas thinks about Dugan is really weird. He thinks that Dugan is secretly a Maoist. Look, I want to bring up this quote real quick from. Just give me 1 second here. So he says, just real quickly, he says, he asked rhetorically, what if the fourth political theory, which for those of you who don't know, that's the sort of ideology or the sort of project that Dugan himself has sort of named. So what if the fourth political theory is none other than Marxist-Leninism itself? And then he's only the option of a fourth political theory, but a fifth, sixth, seventh, etc. political theory are already integral to the constant self-revolutionizing, self-reforming, and self-reconstructing nature of Chinese communism or Maoism. So he basically wants to say that, yeah, actually Dugan is a secret, like Marxist-Leninist Maoist. And I think that tells you how serious we should take his claims about Duganism.
No, I think Haas, in a lot of ways, we've already made it clear that he's the ultimate kind of pick and choose ideology man here. And he really tried to push the claim that not just Stalin was, that basically like he admitted, and we got him like, look, Stalin didn't try to be the czar. He didn't seek the approval of the church to be appointed czar in some ceremony. But Haas says, even though that didn't even happen, we need to like be generous. And because of supposed economic benefit to the country, we need to view the communists in the light of what they did and how they're actually can be viewed in Orthodox light and fulfilling that same legacy of the czar. And that's just, I'm sorry, but that's just completely absurd. Even looking at something like Mount Athos, we've all seen the famous photo where Putin went to Athos, and I'm sure some, very perhaps zealous monarchist monks, I believe, had him positioned where it appears that he's kind of standing in the throne of the emperor and bishop, where the only non-bishops that would be allowed to sit or stand there would be the emperor, with the implication, of course, being that Putin is more akin to an emperor than the Soviet. That was no Soviet people ever visited Mount Athos. There was never anything like that. And so it's clear that the monks on Athos, who many kind of view as Athos as the center of Orthodoxy, they see now a Christian ruler of Russia, someone who openly participates in Christian rituals, someone who openly defends the church. He views them as someone that could be They view this as a return to that form of the pre-communist emperors than anything going on during the Soviet Union. So I just think that argument's very silly. And I wanted to read this quote from St. John of Kronstadt, and this is published in the Romanov Royal Martyrs, What Silence Could Not Conceal book from St. John the Forerunner Monastery, I believe in Cyprus. And this has been blessed by Elder Ephraim of America, who will be canonized soon as a saint of the Americas here. And one of his monasteries is nearby where I live. And I wanted to read this quote at the front of this book, which really sets a lot of things straight and presents through sheer analysis of newly translated diary entries and documents the most elaborate and detailed picture we have of the martyrdom of the Tsar and his family and what was really going on in history prior to the Bolshevik Revolution. St. John said in 1905, "We have a Tsar of righteous and pious life. God has sent a heavy cross of suffering to him as to his chosen one and beloved child. If there is no repentance in the Russian people, God will remove from it the pious Tsar and send a scourge in the person of impure, cruel, self-called rulers who will drench the whole land in blood and tears." And we made this point to Haas that, look, we're not revolutionaries per se. I wouldn't have supported Yeltsin. I don't think anyone here supported Yeltsin when he did what he did. That's not to say that we also don't support the fall of the Soviet Union. But much like in the Old Testament, the Babylonian and Assyrian and even the Egyptians were sent as scourges of God to occupy and even subjugate and send into exile his chosen people and their kingdom. And it's not like we are pro-Babylonian. It's not like we're pro-Assyrian. It's not like we're pro-Nero or any of these people or anything like that. But we know that these are things sent and controlled by God. That's the big difference between us and Haas. Haas believes that through dialectical materialism, man should do what he can to usher in this worker's paradise and be a slave to quote-unquote humanity, whereas we ultimately trust in God and look to an eternal kingdom to come. And of course, I want to get a bit of Dimitri's thoughts on this, but Haas was, I think, completely incapable of grasping this idea.
No, absolutely not. And I mean, from our perspective, or at least what Haz was trying to defer to us was, hey, maybe there can be this transfer from this catacon monarchist orthodox system to, say, an orthodox communism of some sort. Like there is this like transfer, this, you know, in a way it's very Marxist, that, you know, the sort of conversion from a capitalist society to, you know, it's like a civilizational progress to something more pure. And in fact, he was trying to push this idea that, hey, communism was this even purer version of orthodoxy, and that it was more orthodox, as Momcilo mentioned, in its content, right? Even more, you know, communists were even more Christian in their conduct than actual Christians, especially those in the late Russian Empire. And of course, the analogy which he didn't bring up, which, you know, if he did, it would have sounded a lot more convincing. I'll probably throw him a bone here if he is listening. So if he made, say, a reference to the Gospels, right, which I'm not sure if he's read or not, it's not up to me to judge, but this reference wasn't made. If he said, well, Christians are hypocrites, you know, Christ criticized hypocrites quite often in the Gospels, you'll read this. Especially notice how he mentions the Samaritans in the north. You know, he does the Good Samaritan parable where the Samaritans don't actually even follow the laws, yet are more internally predisposed to goodness than even the Pharisees and some of the members of Israel and the Jews. He could have made that analogy, right? So the communists are the Good Samaritans who stop by the road and actually help the person in need. But he doesn't even go there. He just says, well, communists are just more predisposed. But I think the analogy, the best analogy, at least for the Orthodox side, towards this idea that, hey, communists just love sharing and they love providing love and all of this goodness towards towards other people. So they are the actual Christians at the end of the day. Would be of course the idea of monasticism, and, you know, and some writers have actually mentioned this, the idea of no private property and this semi-socialist lifestyle in monasteries, right? So you have to understand, or in Orthodox monasticism, which we did mention, of course, in the debate. We mentioned monasticism appeared only in the 4th century AD, of course, in its official form in the Roman Empire. But monasticism does have this idea where a Christian person can upgrade his life and focus strictly on the spiritual, not on the material, and even live in communities where everything is shared, and these communities are segregated by sex and gender. And of course, it's strictly focusing on the matters of the spirit, on prayer, on going to church. And, you know, as you guys and girls may know, this is the primary sort of idea of monasticism, that you move closer to God and away from worldly things which distract us from, you know, theosis, essentially. But, he doesn't even do that. He doesn't even compare monasticism. He doesn't bring up monasticism at all, which would have been like a perfect strike, saying, hey, look, the peak of orthodoxy, most of these saints you guys are referencing are actually monastics, and monasticism is this form of orthodoxy. But here's a counterpoint. Now, I know I'm maybe arguing with a straw man here, and this is a bit sidetracked, but I do want to make this clear. All of these discussions have occurred before. It's just a matter of has educating himself on the subject matter at hand. Orthodox Christians have interacted with socialists since its inception, okay, in the 1800s. So we do know all of the arguments. We have counter arguments. It's already all on paper. It's just a matter of people going out there actually reading and doing their homework. So the discourse in regards to monasticism would be, well, monks usually do say, especially to, monks who actually go through their disciplined prayers and they fast on Wednesdays and Fridays. In fact, monks fast 24/7 almost, you can say, except for feast days. They don't eat any meat. They don't drink milk. They don't drink alcohol except on Sundays. There's this really strict lifestyle monks adhere to, but the wise elders and saints, especially those belonging to the monastic ranks, would say that, look, even Satan, right, the leader of the demons and the fallen angel, he fasts always. He doesn't need food or drink or sleep. He is very disciplined in the fact that he actually keeps to, all of the commandments that God, puts upon humans, except the fact that he doesn't have love. He's prideful. So these notice the internal tenets of Christianity, the reverence for God, the reverence for the saints, actually participation in the sacraments. Satan doesn't actually have that. He doesn't have humility. So so as much as the external is important, which he claims that, look, externally the communists they do act very Christian. They share belongings, they help out the needy, things of this nature, right? It's almost as if they are Christian in everything but the internal. But that's the thing, the internal does matter. Sacramentology, being close to God, kissing icons, prayers, these things are not simply theoretical, or they are actually practical. They do bring you in closeness with God. And of course, bringing it back to monarchism, like the idea of, just kind of finishing on this subject, the idea of monarchy is a part of that. Like the Orthodox monarch, Saint Nicholas II, was a particular ruler with a particular graceful blessing on him, and to simply dismiss that and say that that blessing can be transferred to, an atheist of like such as Mao Zedong, or whoever has made it designated, simply sacrilegious, I think, and a little bit ignorant of the tradition. So there's that consideration. There's the debate's been going on for a long time, and it just seems like, Has was just not familiar with the particular, argument that me and Conrad were essentially ready for, and Momcilo as well. We came with receipts, we came with references, citations, but what we got was an uncooked meal, essentially, something not fully prepared, and we just had to kind of digest it on the go.
Let's not forget that we were in there to talk about like Ukraine and Serbia, and he just came in with his live stream audience and audience messaging him, and we were still ready I didn't look anything up that entire time. But in all of that, everything you said, that was us also, what Dimitri just said is also us literally steel manning Haas, like giving him the benefit of the doubt on his revisionism and on all of his stuff about Lenin not really being guilty. And let's not forget, Haas opened the debate basically apologizing for Lenin, saying he had nothing to do with the murder of the Tsar and his family, that's all, that was bad, blah, blah, blah. And then I see his followers spamming disgusting cringe soy jack memes about killing the Tsar and his family, and then within an hour of the debate, he's completely slandering the Romanovs, saying, basically not saying it directly, but implying that he doesn't care about that, the martyrdom and everything, because they were foreign and got what they did. Literally spouting, I'm sorry, but like Zionist, communist, Jewish propaganda that which comes up later. And of course, later on his stream, after I booted him out for being a nonsensical grug brain and just completely derailing the debate, he's spewing stuff about how real Christianity and how we need to unite. Abrahamism needs to unite against Satan, as in Muslims, Jews, and Christians. And he starts getting extremely ecumenical and saying how religious divisions are a distraction. And he literally starts screaming that I will unite under communism, like as opposed to uniting under Christianity or Islam or whatever it is people might identify, that we all need to identify under communism. And his followers are saying things like, like Abrahamic alliance against Satan. And it's like, are you even aware of the state of the question of ecumenism and Antichrist in Orthodoxy? Like, why would you bring this to us as some kind of argument, Haas? Like, have you read Father Seraphim? Of course he hasn't, but have you read Father Seraphim Rose? The Vatican goes around the world with the few liberal patriarchs and ecumenist patriarchs that exist and Muslim leaders and form these Abrahamic faith worship centers on top of ziggurats. And the shrine, the national shrine at 9/11, St. Nicholas, which has become a massive scandal in the Greek church of how long it took to construct and where all the money went. And I'm skeptical of that whole thing to begin with. They have this silly Abrahamic faith, prayer, center, unity thing, and it's entirely supervised by the globalist Atlantic powers that Haas supposedly claims to be against. Yet no, he thinks we all need to unite and put theology and put actual dogma and these things aside, and he doesn't care about the sacraments. This is like infantile, like childish stuff, frankly, and like sounds a lot more like fedora atheism and libtardism, frankly, than some kind of based fourth position or whatever Haas wants his position to be that any given day.
So I wanted to touch on a couple of things here. So with regards to Haas picking and choosing things that he likes from him offhand, but I think it's worth noting is Walter Benjamin. So Walter Benjamin, he's an interesting figure. He has like this famous essay that people have read, or some people have read, about how it's called like the age of art and the age of mechanical reproduction, basically talking about how artwork is changing due to the camera. And he talks about this, like I guess, like the early 20th century, like pre-World War I stuff. But as well as he was a Marxist, and he has this. He has I think the very last thing he wrote before he killed himself in 1940, 41, I forget. He wrote, it was called this aphorisms. I totally forgot what it's called. I'm so sorry. But anyways, there's like this famous aphorism. The first one it's kind of famous. It talks about how there's this like mechanical Turk that plays chess, and it can never lose, right? And then he says that, oh yeah, by the way, that's called he calls that historical materialism or dialectical materialism. Basically, that's Walter Benjamin saying that under Stalinism or under this sort of Soviet communism, whatever they want is communism, and whatever they don't like is just not communism. They can never be wrong. There's no way to falsify it whatsoever. And he's critiquing that. And by the way, Walter Benjamin was associated with people like Adorno and the Frankfurt School at large. Like those are kind of his buddies, but he died in like 1940, 41. I forget the exact date. And he was clearly critiquing the Soviet Union, but Haas says, no. In actuality, this guy who's associated with the Frankfurt School, who Haas absolutely hates the Frankfurt School, he was actually critiquing Western communism or Western Marxism. And then just in general, Walter Benjamin is really good showing, because he likes communism. Walter Benjamin is a communist, he's a Marxist, but he shows the sort of Kabbalistic element of Marxism, but he likes that element of it. So he's really giddy when he talks about the sort of a messianic, Kabbalistic, the Tikkun Olam aspect of Marxism. And so I brought that up. And Haas, if you brought that up to Haas, he would probably just call you like an anti-Semite, even though Walter Benjamin is a like a German Jew who wrote about how Marxism is basically Kabbalah.
I was going to ask you just before, if you can say what you were going to say there too, but if you have any interesting receipts or anything, because I know we had some interesting followers of ours sending some good scans of books about the Soviet Union's early connections with the State of Israel, of course, Lenin's status as both a German agent and somewhat influenced by initial anti-Christian sentiment due to some Jewish background. I'm wondering if you have any interesting receipts there and some background that Haas very much likes to ignore and suddenly begins to sound a lot like a liberal when you bring that question up. He kind of, as Dimitri said, spilled the spaghetti when he started screaming at me about not turning on his Hasidic brothers.
So with regards to Lenin, there's his 1905 pamphlet, Socialism and Religion, where he says that we need to spread atheism to the proletariat. And then if you go, I'll give you guys the link so you can get the article wrote with Zoltanis a while ago when we had our spat with Haas. And there's a bunch of quotes from both Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and I think even Stalin here, about their views of religion, how they're basically anti-religion, but also their views of nationalism, and how they're anti-nationalism and complete like sort of globalist internationalist. And then I was just in general just going to say that what kind of seconding what Dimitri said about how Haas totally ignores the relationship between Orthodoxy and Marxism, just even from the intellectual perspective, even before 1917. I don't think there was any prominent Orthodox people who were in favor of communism whatsoever. I mean, maybe you had a couple of like priests who were like in favor of it, but besides that, they were always very much against Marxism and communism, even before 1917, and then 1917 afterwards, they were also that too. So I just find it really funny that he thinks that he can give one quote that's somewhat sympathetic to communism from the Khrushchev era. And by the way, he doesn't like Khrushchev. Right, he's a Stalinist who thinks that Khrushchev is this, it's like this, the great Satan because he, denounced Stalin. And I don't know why he used this as proof, but he totally ignores that history. And it's also important to remember. That the guy before Haas came on, that we were talking to, one of his fans or whatever, said that Haas was a perennialist.
Yeah, so just so striking on that actually, just so Haas's religious background, notice it wasn't even discussed in the talk. So we kind of assumed he was an atheist from the get-go because, well, communism really doesn't mold very well, you know, with religions, especially. You know, Haas, we knew he was of Middle Eastern background, but we never even assumed he was, say, of an Islamic faith, either Shia or Sunni. You know, what we found out later was that, hey, and of course his follower mentioned that, hey, he was a perennialist, which totally aligned with what Conrad mentioned at the end of the stream. Has went on to mention, hey, let's have this ecumenistic union around communism, and it'll kind of bring us all together. Now, I mean, just as a layman, what does that sound like? You know, the unity of all religions under a certain umbrella for, you know, political goals, maybe to better society. I mean, sounds to me like Freemasonry, frankly. And this is one of the things he kept bringing up was, hey, Freemasonry is this evil. Well, why is Freemasonry evil from your perspective? Like, does Marx speak out against it? Is it evil because it's capitalistic? We have our reasons as to why we Orthodox folks denounce Freemasonry, but it isn't very evident why a communist Marxist would denounce Freemasonry, because sounds like what you're pushing is essentially a similar framework where everybody unites, as opposed to, instead of a lodge at a, you know, proletariat dinner party, or perhaps even you know, at a communist gathering, for example, on Saturday nights. So there is this link there, again, maybe even intellectual and historically inherited from Freemasonry, which, you know, a lot of communists were related to that. Let's just not forget that a lot of the communists pre-Lenin in Russia, so essentially while Lenin was living in Switzerland and in exile, not in the Russian Empire, the head Jaidze, for example, of the Petrograd Soviet, they were all Freemasons and, of course, members of the Russian Masonic lodges. So all the prominent communists in Russia prior to Lenin were all Freemasons, and they handed power over to the Bolsheviks. You know, essentially, they were cooperating with Bolsheviks. All of the initial communists in Russia prior to Lenin's coming in October, they were all Freemasons. So communism and Freemasonry, they aren't exactly at odds from the get-go, but let me just speak about this Big Ten ecumenism, which, you know, Haas mentioned, because, look, so he doesn't want atheism. Sure, we understand that. Okay. He picks and chooses, discards atheism. What does he want? Does he want an ecumenist perennialism, as, you know, Momcilo mentioned that his follower, you know, claimed that has subscribed to? Well, if that's the case, well, Haas also mentions the condition that, hey, MAGA communism is a very practical movement. He kept moving away from this conversation. Notice how he kept saying, "Oh, we're not about the theory. We're not about that spirituality, spiritual gobbledygook, all that extra sacramentology. Like we respect that. We think it improves humanity, but we can't really get caught up in the weeds here. We cannot be Pharisees. We cannot be, cannot follow the letter of the law, people of the book." He kept bringing up these biblical analogies, which really didn't fit anywhere, frankly. But he kept saying we can't actually follow the tenets of the religion exactly. Let's follow the spirit of it. It's like, okay, sure, let's follow the spirit. So you want to be a practical political, and you want to be a practical political movement. MAGA communism. MAGA assumes make America great again, right? That's the abbreviation. So in the context of a United States, say it's the year is 2045, Jackson Hinkle and Has are, movers of MAGA communism. It is successful in the US. How will they, just judging by Haz's interaction with us, 2 or 3 Orthodox Christians, how will he convince Orthodox Christians, some homesteading, gun-toting, free Orthodox Christians in the US, to actually adhere to this ecumenistic, somewhat Freemasonic sounding movement, and just claiming that, hey, we're all Abrahamic, just join in, don't worry about all this Kabbalistic, baggage that Marxism and Leninism has, from the 1800s. Don't worry about all this theoretical nonsense that doesn't align with your Christian faith. Just come join us. We will all be together. So there's this, there's a certain impracticality, and Has really didn't show how exactly we Orthodox Christians are meant to discard some of our concerns and actually join into this ecumenistic, and why should we? Was Has even aware of how true Orthodox Christian beliefs do not align with ecumenism and how that's an issue for us? I'm not sure he was, because there is this understanding with him where it's like, well, we can just discard some of the details of the faith and not follow the Nicene Creed. Well, no, we must follow some of these tenets. These are the foundations of the faith. We cannot compromise on anything here. So again, has a misunderstanding of Christianity, and then claiming that his movement was practical and somehow Orthodox Christians can, join join this ecumenical side of, you know, this MAGA communism. I think it was completely absurd. And, you know, listening to that recording in hindsight, I think that kind of brought it out even more.
Well, I think in many ways, I said this at the very beginning, people are getting shoehorned, they're trying to shoehorn this silly dialectic as the Russia thing really reshapes the world and multipolarity rises. They're bringing out this dialectic of neoliberalism versus quote unquote based communism. And notice, you push a little bit, and what can't you talk about under based communism? Well, I guess you can't talk about Judaism, you can't talk about theology, and you can't talk about, you know, the sacredness of monarchy. So if that's the case, then I want nothing to do with it. And then you take on, in fact, all of this ecumenistic, Abrahamic stuff. Like, this is just one world religion Satanism, if not, you're right, Freemasonry at the very least. And I was just going to make a funny point. I doubt these dialectical materialists have really deconstructed their cosmology or anything. They claim to have, you know, fully deconstructed all their meta-narratives and all their analysis of history, yet I'm sure they know nothing about the Freemasonic roots of their own cosmology that they believe, as well as, you know, the roots of Copernican and Galilean in esotericism and Vatican corruption. They don't think about any of that because these people are still stuck in that. Frankly, it's still stuck in a post-Enlightenment view in many ways, even though they claim to be postmodern. But I think a lot of things. Haas talked about communism in Russia, and he views Russia as this big thing for communism. Russia and China, he loves them. He thinks communism is rising in Eurasia. Whereas I think just consult Joel Davis and Keith Woods on the fact that China is much more akin to a national socialist state than some kind of Marxist dogmatic nation. And I think for Russia, he talked about the Communist Party in Russia and how big it is and how relevant they are and everything. But in Russia, communism is like Reaganism is in America. It's for boomers. It's nostalgia for the Soviet Union. It's people that hated living through the 90s, that wish that the Soviet Union had never collapsed, so they never had to go through that and kind of get liquidated and start from zero. It was a horrible time. But now the rising civilization in Russia is not communist. It's still actually finding itself, and it may be monarchist in the future. As of now, it's very much Orthodox, and now it's reasserting itself on a territorial basis. And Haas seems to care more about how he can shape and meme that into communism, which is just silly to me. I don't know if Dimitri wants to talk on that a little bit, and then I want to give Momcilo the chance to talk about to land the plane a little bit on Lenin and communism and any details he wants to provide.
Yeah, essentially there's this export going on of like the idea that Russia will somehow benefit MAGA communism, but essentially what is happening in Russia right now is that socialism is taking a back step. What we're seeing is the victory of Orthodoxy, or at least of the Orthodox belief that, hey, Russia and Ukraine at least need to be united in some spiritual notice. That's in regards to the church matters as well as cultural sense, but communists from the get-go were trying to disunite Ukraine and trying to Ukrainianize Ukraine to the point where, it completely disconnected from Russia artificially. So again, and Momcilo did mention that Stalin was a big internationalist, so let's not forget that Stalin actually was in favor of the fact that Ukrainians were this distinct people, like separate from Russia, and Russians were chauvinistic. You guys can go read all of this up. I mean, Trotsky, Lenin, these people all believed in this idea that the Russian Empire needed to be dissected, like a black mass sort of ritual. It was completely rotten and had nothing to do with, of course, Russian culture, Russian identity, or any Russian inherited heritage. It's a 1,000-year-old tradition. So, and obviously nothing to do with Christianity at all. So there's this idea that Has keeps pushing that, look, Russia will have this impact on the future of America, on the future of MAGA communism, but we don't see any MAGA communism or anything of the sort in Russia itself. I mean, we can mention some of those socialist leanings of the Donbass folks and some of the communist, some of the socialist / the very light communist brigades that acted in Donbass, but Has doesn't even go on to mention them. I mean, I'm here mentioning them now, but yes, there are Christian socialists and so-called Orthodox communists in Russia, yes, but these people do not debate. Their ideas are mostly very ill-founded, and they don't make it very far. And yes, the leader of the Communist Party in Russia at the moment, Gennady Zyuganov, who's been active, he's essentially like the communist mirror of Zhirinovsky, who recently passed away, God rest his soul. Gennady Zyuganov is very much a boomer. He's about as a boomer of a politician as you can get, and that's why he's actually failed to win any presidential election since the 90s. This man's been trying for 30 years and he can't even get his act straight. So that's really not a good example. And I respect Gennady Zyuganov. I think he's done very well to support the Putin presidency over the last 20 years. But he failed in the 90s, actually not beating Yeltsin and allowing the Russian corruption to go on. And of course, not even saving Russia in the 90s. Gennady Zyuganov wasn't Putin he was more of like a failed version of even Zhirinovsky. Zhirinovsky is more of a traitor and a Judas, but yeah, that's if we're going to speak about domestic politics here. But even Zhuganov, like, I mean, his ideology is, pretty artificial to this point. I don't even think he understands why he's an Orthodox Christian as opposed to an atheist, why he can pick and choose communist doctrine and kind of discard atheism all of a sudden. I don't think he's thought about it any more deeper than has. And of course, Russia now, of course, is on the forefront. So there's a lot of essentially people kind of clinging onto this idea that, hey, if Russia rises, maybe I can get a piece of the pie. Well, Russia's rising, but the piece of the pie is not communist and it isn't socialist, at least not like we don't really have any say in it. But what we are observing has no the influence here is definitely not Maga communism. It definitely isn't Leninism, and in fact, some of the statues of Lenin are, yes, so some of them are being put back up, falsely and wrongly around Ukraine. The statues that Ukrainians have, destroyed, alongside, of course, many imperial and Orthodox statues, and Orthodox churches have been burnt. Ukrainians don't just destroy communist monuments, which Russians for some reason are restoring, but they also destroy any monuments that have to do with Russian history. So that's what the consideration there, okay? Just this, that's kind of a side point, but yeah, there is this understanding, of course, the wrong understanding that has that he can kind of grift off of Russia's success and kind of push this towards political success in the United States. But the United States, because MAGA communism is specifically about the US. So what is he trying to achieve in the US? What does this have to do with Orthodoxy, which is Russia's calling card at the moment? Putin is making references to the gospel in almost every single long speech, which is over 20 minutes. He's referencing Christian scripture, not Marx, not Lenin, and definitely not Stalin. So again, yeah, it seems to be a grift at this point, and that's me putting it lightly. And there also, I mean, at the end of the day, this could, as Momcilo did mention earlier, it could just be a personality-driven movement, which it does seem to be, but if it will have any sort of intellectual results, or if it will yield anything positive, at least in a political sense, they will need to work on some of these sticking points, maybe even make some, produce a manifesto of sorts which we can read and actually understand what MAGA communists literally believe in, as opposed to having some of these, I'm not sure what to even call them, some of these infrared community members come into our Twitter spaces and post online and claim things which don't exactly align even with what their leader says. Like, for example, one of them claims that Haz is a perennialist, and one of them claims that Haz is a Shia Muslim. Which one is it? So anyways, the claims are all different. Momcilo, I'm not sure what your opinion is on this, but I'll let you have your say.
Yeah, I think Haz and his movement is very cult of personality driven. Not necessarily I don't think it's a cult per se, but as in the sense it's all around Haz's personality. He's very verbose. He's very sort of in your face. He's very much a character. I think we saw this with the way that he acted on the Twitter Spaces, where since he was live streaming himself, he needs to put on a sort of show with his audience, and everything has to become this sort of spectacle, right? Everything's like, oh yeah, like every conversation he has to make a huge deal about, MAGA communism undefeated, infrared undefeated, we stay winning. He has to put on this, big show rather than having more nuanced view on things. It's very, spectacular in the worst sense of the word. And I guess just to kind of wrap up here, just to say, I have my articles that they'll be in the description that go way more in depth on what exactly Marxists believed and how far off Haz is with that. But even then, so there's both problems with Marxism, Orthodox a lowercase o Orthodox Marxism, sort of from Marx, Engels, Lenin. There's problems with that Marxism. However, there's also problems with Haz's view of Marxism. However, Haz also has another problem where he's trying to claim the inheritance of the original Marxism, but he fails to do that. And even just kind of system, regardless of how it accords or doesn't accord to Marxism, it also fails on its own grounds as well. So there's that sort of two-pronged attack that I think we're making against Haz. Not only is he a bad Marxist, he's also just his philosophy, regardless of how true to Marxism it is totally wrong. And I think that the best way to sort of look at Marxism, generally speaking, including Haz's sort of chimera version of it, is to look at the sort of the story of the prodigal son, right? So it's Marxism is the ideology of the son who goes off with his father's inheritance, and that inheritance is our moral epistemological framework. And he goes out with that inheritance, and he tries to create all these systems, but then he ends up, blowing all that inheritance because it's inherently parasitical due to the dialectical and the revolutionary nature of Marxism. It ends up overturning that inheritance, which was making. So Marxism is the ideology of the prodigal son. It's the son going out with his father's inheritance, and that inheritance is the moral epistemology of the Christian worldview. And then he goes about, blowing all of that. But the problem is that with his idea of revolution, so that's like parting in the parable, with like revolution, he's overturning his own inheritance. He's making mute with dialectics and revolution the inheritance, which is giving him a groundwork to even believe in things like the dignity of man, to believe in freedom, to believe that you should do some actions and not do other actions. This idea that like raping people is wrong, for instance. Just basic things. He's overturning that, and then he's going to end up blowing all of his inheritance due to the parasitical nature of dialects or materialist dialectic in this case. And then once there's going to be a famine, once these ideas are instituted, and then he's going to have to come back to the father, which is going to have to be orthodoxy. So that's the way that I view Marxism. It's going to blow all of its inheritance. It's going to blow all the foundations that make it even somewhat plausible. And then the only way that you can save it is coming back to the Father, coming back to the Orthodox Church, or coming to it if you've never experienced it before.
I think that's a great way to leave it, Momcilo. Dimitri and I are going to talk a little bit about the news, but I think he's got to get going. So we want to thank him again. We're going to have all that in the description, and we'll probably have him on again soon. This was a fantastic discussion. I think y'all are really going to like it. So God bless, man.
All right. Thank you. See you guys soon.
See you.
Thank you so much, Momcilo. This was a great segment at the beginning. So now me and Dimitri are going to get into a bit more of a standard World War now, talk about the news, talk about World War III as it continues. And to kind of bridge this a little bit, though, one of the things Haas talked about so much was like the main citation, really the only citation he had in the church, was Nikodem Muratov, Archbishop. He was, I believe, Patriarch Kirill's spiritual father, writing some semi-pro-communist things at the time of Khrushchev. I believe we briefly mentioned him. Momcilo brought him up. And I know Dimitri knows more about him than me. He's going to talk a little bit about that. But it was to say that is not sufficient evidence to epistemologically or, ground Haas's claim in Orthodox tradition that's not true, to say the least.
Yeah, so essentially, while the Orthodox Church was under soft persecution during the 1960s, so religion was legal in the Soviet Union, but, it was heavily censored, and, communism was propagandized to the point where even Orthodox priests and bishops were under pressure to actually produce pro-communist works. And this fellow Metropolitan Nikodem and Archbishop Nikodem, he was both Metropolitan and Archbishop, actually, of two different cities, but he was this, I suppose, the most eloquent and popular character at the time of the 1960s in the Soviet Union. So in many ways, if many of you are familiar with the current Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox Church of America, Archbishop Elpidophoros, he was essentially what I would say would be a lighter version, the equivalent of an Elpidophoros. So just as talented in terms of like making a scene, but also maybe not as degenerate, so to speak. And of course, Archbishop Nikodem, let's give a bit of some of his biography. So he was actually the youngest bishop at the time to be ordained at only 31 years of age. So very talented man. But his talent, and I think this is based on what some of the contemporaries of Archbishop Nikodem actually remember about him, is that his talent actually consisted in his managerial role. So as we know, bishops in the church are managers, administrators, and he could actually manage and administer clergymen very well, and he knew exactly who to promote to clergyhood and who would actually serve a good role for the people. And this was his, I suppose, talent, because the man was quite talented. So Archbishop Nikodem Muratov essentially surrounded himself with extreme talent, and one of those talented men was the young seminary, future graduate patriarch, the future patriarch Kirill Gundyaev. So the future patriarch of Russia was one of his apprentices, and Archbishop and Metropolitan Nikodem was his spiritual father, as well as his, I suppose, protege. He kind of taught him the ways of of Orthodoxy, essentially of Russian Orthodoxy in the most elite fashion. Theology, how do you administer the church, and we see Patriarch Kirill has used a lot of that knowledge today. But Archbishop Nikodem, of course, had some questionable opinions on communism, which he wrote under probably a lot of severe pressure in the 60s and 70s. And the other controversial thing about Archbishop Nikodem, which I think it was very inappropriate of Haz to bring him up as his main source of Orthodox Church supporting communism, because of Archbishop Nikodem's articles, like, this is just, I'm not going to say it's disingenuous, but it is a very low blow. It's similar to using St. Augustine against the Orthodox Church. Just because St. Augustine had a few mistakes doesn't make him not Orthodox. But Archbishop Nikodem, of course, was a big-time ecumenist in the 60s and 70s during, of course, the EP Athenagoras' reign as well. So he participated in all of those ecumenical movements from the Russian perspective, and he even ended up dying, actually, funny enough. And people even say to this day, providentially, he was visiting Rome, and while he was at the Vatican, he actually became very ill, and he died with the Pope reading the prayers over him. So he died technically even in the arms of the Pope, so while he was conducting ecumenist meetings. So in a very providential fashion, Nikodem Rotov passed away in 1978 and left the Russian Church with some good and some pretty bad traditions, which to this day, of course, we don't like to speak ill of the dead. But yeah, so there is that tradition of him passing away at the Vatican, very providential in my mind.
Well, and Momcilo had mentioned that Haz is citing this person as praising communism during the Khrushchev era, which Haz, of course, despises. But moving a little bit aside from Haz, and the Vatican is in the news recently with the posthumous book published by Pope Benedict. Of course, the Vatican and its geopolitical intrigue and roots go back even before the Enlightenment. It's kind of, we would consider the schism in the Vatican institution kind of a pre-Enlightenment in the Christian world as far as the degradation of the apostolic deposit goes. Haz, of course, has no idea about any of that. Sorry to keep going back to that guy. But I think on the Vatican front with Pope Benedict, it's fascinating. It's not necessarily anything surprising about his disgust at the abuse, his disgust of the fact that many seminaries are just gay dating zones and gay hospices and stuff, because he's kind of said. And it seems that as many people in the Catholic world are kind of, that they aren't sedevacantists, not necessarily even going SSPX, but they are they almost like hinting at the idea that, oh, now the see may be vacant now that Pope Benedict died and that Pope Francis, because they really just don't like Pope Francis. And Pope Francis seems to be unperturbed by this. He was very recently issuing statements against sodomy laws, against any kind of criminalization of homosexual acts, being frankly very dishonest, implying that those laws make thinking in your head or being attracted to people illegal, when in reality it's just the actual act, which he admits later in the speech is a sin. So it's a bit disingenuous there, but it proves that he is not perturbed by this kind of 15th century intrigue where a pope posthumously publishing a huge expose and his true feelings on the institution of the Vatican.
Yeah, and of course, Pope Benedict actually speaking about the, I guess I'll just call it openly, the gay lobby of the Roman Catholic Church in the 21st century. It is very curious to note that how does this tie into geopolitics? Well, essentially, as you may understand, there is a lot of geopolitics. Of course, there's a lot of espionage ongoing, and so you have Catholic priests all around the world serving various nations, and even nations with very high-tech surveillance capabilities. And homosexuality and LGBTQ relations are not necessarily legal yet in the Roman Catholic Church, so anyone caught under those circumstances engaging in those actions will be, of course, renounced and would lose their status in the Catholic Church. It's a very prestigious organization and worldly affairs. So what you have is you have these, this issue that Pope Benedict is basically saying that, hey, look, there's actually a lot of homosexuals serving in the Roman Catholic Church, even from seminary, and this essentially means that there is this weak spot in the Roman Catholic Church, whereas you'd have these priests perhaps engaging in homosexual acts around the world, and the compromise, the blackmail potential of espionage, in institutions, for example, the CIA, Mossad, for example, just spying on these priests, actually engaging in these activities and using it as blackmail against the Roman Catholic Church, which is why a lot of Roman Catholic churches around the world, particular local churches, they are very much compromised in certain ways. Like in Germany, there's this big divide between what they actually believe in, and in the US, I think there's a lot of internal subversion going on. And some of the subversion, of course, will probably be through LGBTQ blackmail institutions by the state departments of the relevant nations. And I think that's one of the considerations there, is that, yes, actually having that reality, and Pope Benedict exposing it says a lot about the Roman Catholic Church and exactly how compromised of an institution it is from the get-go, and even at the basic clerical level, even local priests. I'm not even going to speak about bishops, because in the Roman Catholic Church all priests are supposed to be celibate, let alone so not engaging with women, let alone men or anybody else for that matter.
Well, and even from our perspective, a lot of the ways there's obviously all this abuse, and as Dimitri said, that presents a lot of within the Vatican itself. We know there are many priests. There are priests employed at the Vatican, which is a city-state. It's a very important key piece in the Mediterranean and the world geopolitically. And there's priests in there that all this homosexual blackmail stuff is real. I mean, even just watch the show The Young Pope. I think that's a pretty good show and a good insight into a lot of how this stuff goes. But I think even more than that, from our perspective of what we speak about on World War Now, many Catholics and Catholics that are traditional and conservative, they love to speak about Fatima, and we talk about Russia and Ukraine, and we're going to get a bit more into that, as well as Germany and the German bishops are where the Catholic Church is really falling apart. The German and Belgian bishops are writing homosexual blessings for homosexual unions, performing these rites, basically defying the Vatican stance, and the Vatican isn't doing what they're doing. Isn't really doing much. It's kind of just letting them do that, let it take its time, but they're really persecuting the traditional Latin Mass. That's something that they seem to be willing to do post-haste. But even more than that, with Fatima and these sort of things, from so many levels, this institution, I believe, is exposing itself as compromised to the world, to the point where it can only be stated that it fell off theologically and is now reaping those consequences through papism, filioque, ADS, all sorts of other things that have split it from orthodoxy. It has now become a institution of the world serving the interests of certain men. And that's not to say there aren't many faithful, good Catholics, and even Catholics who are fighting the good fight on the geopolitical front, but it's very obvious that the prophecies of Fatima, even despite, I believe, those priests who have good intentions looking at an orthodox reading of it, which is basically only interpreting one prophecy from it as opposed to all the secret lore that's been added on, it's very clearly a Cold War propaganda tactic. And we see it being echoed with Pope Francis's consecration of Russia to the Sacred Heart for the fourth or fifth time that it's supposedly been done by Roman Catholicism. And it just doesn't seem that this institution is able to, whether it's prophetically or institutionally or theologically, guide this flock of 1 billion, Christians around the world. And I think as we see this unfold with Pope Benedict, that's just kind of another piece on that. And that isn't to say that, bad things happen in the church or priests are corrupt, therefore your church is wrong. No, there's theological and historical arguments for that. But to say that this wouldn't lead from the latter happening, that is also true.
Very well said, Conrad. And of course, moving on to the fact that Germany at the moment is not just compromised in a spiritual sense, but of course geopolitically, Germany has recently agreed to send its Leopard 2 tanks to the Ukraine, of course aiding the Ukraine in both a monetary and humanitarian sense, which it was doing for a few months now, but finally actually breaking the tradition which has existed since World War II of not actually supplying military aid to any nation, and finally they're actually supplying not just any military aid but actual tanks in significant numbers, significantly I suppose, to make an actual dent in the Russian lines. And Germany has agreed to supply Leopard 2 tanks, and in answer to that, of course, you have the United States under Joe Biden going against his own words and agreeing to send 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine as well. Now, the important note here is, of course, that the Leopard 2 tanks from Germany will arrive a lot sooner, and I believe even as we speak now, it's been about a week since this news has been announced, or maybe a bit less than a week, but these Leopard 2 tanks will shortly arrive in the Ukraine. They'll be, they'll be quickly maintenanced, and then they'll be sent to the front lines in very due haste, maybe even before the end of January. So we'll be looking at actually kind of observing how these new tanks from Germany will actually act. Meanwhile, the Abrams tanks, I believe, will come with some delay. Maybe they won't even make it to the Ukraine by springtime, which in Europe would be March. And essentially, if you recall that prediction of Conrad, so of course, the Russian offensive will probably pick up speed towards the end of February. So it'll be interesting to see how these Leopards and Abrams will they provide any sort of issues to the Russians, at least on that particular front.
No, I think in many ways this also comes on the heels of Annalena Baerbock, one of the top officials in Germany, saying that we are fighting a war against Russia, directly saying this. And of course, the German people themselves are very against sending all these tanks. You see all these billboards in Russia in Germany with these things like, are we really doing this again with, sending tanks to Russia? Because, we know how that has ended in the past for people that send infantry and ground forces and these machines into Russia. But the F-16 question is what comes after this, with the Netherlands and the US seeming to kind of want to push the F-16 issue. And remember, Germany, before there was tanks, they had it as their red line, like no tanks. And now that they've sent tanks, they're saying their new red line is no F-16s. So the questions become, how many months is it going to take till Germany sends those planes over? And as Brian Berletic and many other people have said, will Ukraine having a few more F-16s really help anything? No, it's just going to get some pilots killed and cause likely more civilian casualties due to crashing debris and reactivated air defense at high speeds and, more missiles and artillery being shot from the air, as we saw at the very beginning of the conflict in a major way. So I think we're seeing more and more just a slow puddle of escalation. And I think in many ways, we've talked a lot about how Russia could have benefited from striking earlier. In many ways, that's only because you can only say that knowing that the US was going to provoke a conflict eventually. And we see this as compared to China and North Korea. China and North Korea, we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but China and North Korea benefit from waiting. As Taiwan, this political situation with Taiwan and the decline of the US military only makes it more likely as time goes on for an actual peaceful reunification. And then for North Korea, the demographic situation with South Korea is so bad that they're going to, within a few generations, will have a much higher population, not much higher, but we'll have a higher population in South Korea and more fighting age men in general, as South Korea has like a 0.9 birth rate and North Korea has a 1.9 birth rate for its women. So that's just one thing to think about in general when you think about these conflicts and waiting them out. But as far as the Ukraine front goes, there has been general advancements for Russia. They've been moving forward around Ugledar and some of these areas near Donetsk in the region. And this has led to some drama with Strelkov and Prigozhin, but I'm going to let Dmitry unpack a little bit more of that, as well as just the map Sitrep.
Yeah, so essentially, Ugledar is being pushed by the Russians, as well as the fighting on the Zaporozhye end looked like we announced last week that hey, Zaporozhye may begin to come under siege, and that hasn't even occurred yet. So it does seem like the Russians are pushing and prodding at least the front line of the defense, which is a valid strategy. Keep the Ukrainians, I suppose, on their toes, and sort of, as well as for the Ukrainians, it would be beneficial to actually see exactly how entrenched they are. So, Zaporozhye is still not under threat, but we believe in probably towards the end of February, it will be one of the goal cities that Russians will be pushing towards as their sort of main objective. Now, we are seeing some drama, of course, on the Bakhmut Wagner end, where Wagner essentially is inviting that Wagner CEO in chief, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the former chef of Vladimir Putin, has invited Igor Strelkov, one of the primary commentators who we've referenced on the show multiple times, invited him to actually join the mercenary group as a squad commander, which Strelkov is completely capable of fulfilling that role. Which he has fulfilled not just in Donbass, but also in some of the other, let's just say, operations in the post-Soviet theater, which, we can go into Strelkov's pretty rich biography, but there really isn't the time for that now. But Strelkov was invited to join the mercenary group, and he very impolitely declined, saying that Yevgeny Prigozhin didn't ask me correctly and all this other stuff. Now, this of course is reminiscent of Yevgeny Prigozhin asking Alexei Navalny, the Russian oppositionary leader who was imprisoned in one of the prisons in Siberia, to actually join Wagner. And this was taken as a bit of a joke, but Alexei Navalny, of course, again, impolitely declined. So it does seem like Yevgeny Prigozhin is either trolling Strelkov or actually is genuinely wants to bring Strelkov back to the front line, which would be quite interesting. And Strelkov did decline, so for whatever reason, he isn't too keen on joining the musicians and sort of their escapades in Bakhmut and kind of commanding them front and center. So I do think Strelkov is at the moment making some headway in, I suppose, stirring things up on the Russian end. The Russians are very confused and upset at the fact that, he's not actually returning back to the front lines, and it is causing a bit of dismay, especially in the fact that he's very predisposed at critiquing Shoigu, now Prigozhin, and some of the other figures in the Russian military sphere. I'm not saying it's justified or unjustified, that is just a matter of fact. Stilkov is very set on providing constructive and maybe sometimes blackpilling criticism of the Russian leadership, and he continues to do that, I suppose, from an armchair position, but he is a military expert, so perhaps he can do that. Yeah, so essentially, Yevgeny Prigozhin now, of course, is prominent. He's coming up in headlines around the world. The United States have, of course, listed him, the leader of the Wagner mercenary group, as an international terrorist. So essentially, he's on the same level as an Osama bin Laden, even though this guy hasn't committed any terrorist acts. If anything, he's something akin to an Eric Prince who led Blackwater during the Iraq War. So Yevgeny Prigozhin, for those interested, would be like the equivalent of an Eric Prince, but of course the United States is happy with Eric Prince just because he served their needs, but Yevgeny Prigozhin serves the needs of Russia first, and hence he cannot be placed on the same legal level as Mr. Prince.
No, it's true, and I think before we get into North Korea a little bit, I want to hear your thoughts on this, that with Strelkov, I mean, I don't know of any equivalent in Ukraine besides people that are actually just refusing to fight due to poor conditions, that are as high ranking and as just like able to vocally criticize such specific kind of on the ground situations. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on what that says about the structure of Russian command, Russia's relationship with the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, as well as how it compares to the Ukrainian structure and even the structure in Western militaries.
Yeah, so I think, of course, there is this centralized aspect as that we spoke about, that the Russian military, at least on one end, it's very constructive in that the official military has a proper leadership chain, but there are, of course, the Donetsk and Lugansk people's volunteer groups, various battalions of Cossacks, Orthodox battalions, and even some volunteer battalions from overseas coming in to sort of support the freedom of Donbass sort of fighting force. And there are also the Kadyrov battalions, which have their own Chechen Muslim commanders as well as Muslim clerics. So there is this decentralized aspect to the Russian forces, and Wagner, naturally, the mercenaries follow their own leadership, and of course they get paid higher wages. And Strelkov kind of doesn't seem to want to get involved in that anymore, especially after the last controversy where he was, in a very humiliating fashion, kind of sent back home and not given. I think he's still a little bit upset about that. So it does say that, hey, Strelkov's still a bit personally upset about the fact that he wasn't allowed to fight the first time he was, he actually visited Ukraine at the end of 2022, and he was essentially had to return back to Moscow. Now, I think what it does say about the Russian structure is that Strelkov does have a roof over his head, so to speak. He is one of the only people who can actually criticize the war effort without any reprimands. He hasn't been taken to court. Technically he has broken laws relating to misinformation, or at least these are very broad this new sort of statutes that Russia has implemented, that hey, you cannot actually spread misinformation about the special military operation. But Strelkov has really pushed that limit, and nobody's taken him to court or prosecuted him. The Russian attorney generals have kind of withheld. So I do think he has an umbrella over him in terms of he's allowed to actually criticize Shoigu, criticize the military leadership, Gerasimov. Surovikin he hasn't really touched yet, but Prigozhin now, I think he's going to start getting on Prigozhin's nerves. But notice how he's not actually being touched, criticized, or even openly targeted for anything. It seems that maybe his older connections in the FSB still have his back in the Kremlin somewhere. So Strelkov does have big sponsors, I believe, still in the Russian government, which is why his channels are not only blowing up, but also he's able to say what he says without any reprimand.
I think that's a good analysis. And now we're going to move. Speaking of people that say what they don't really want to say with Vucic, and now with North Korea. It seems North Korea has, fully thrown in the towel behind the Russian special military operation. The U.S. is accusing them of arming Russia. It's who was it? Was it Kim Jong-un's sister? She was the one that announced this, I believe, and this comes after some very new missile launches and things of this nature. And I had mentioned before, remember, North Korea, 1.9 birth rate compared to the terrible, I believe, 0.9 birth rate in South Korea. So from that perspective, winning the Korean War, which has supposedly never ended, North Korea is really playing the long game there and could easily win. And we were talking before, Dmitry kind of mentioned how North Korea now is in a very sure position. If World War III or to really go hot between all the global powers, it's very obvious which side North Korea is on. Whereas other countries who are by no means friends of the West, such as Serbia, they're now in an extremely precarious position, totally caught between two two big powers, one of which has been historically a friend, another is their people that have literally dismantled them at every turn, but due to politics and other things, it seems they're unsure of themselves.
Yeah, so Vucic essentially going against Russia now has really kind of thrown a wrench in Serbian-Russian relations. This is going off the back of Novak winning the Australian Open tennis tournament, and of course his father coming out in support of Russia. So essentially kind of showing that Serbian celebrities, the Serbian people as a whole, do in fact still support Russia, but the Serbian leadership seems to be for lack of a better word, cucking out here, or which we coined the phrase, we coined the jargon, the cuck of Kosovo, relating to Mr. Vucic for essentially admitting that, hey, Ukraine and Donbass should belong to Ukraine. The Donbass and Crimea should belong to Ukraine. Basically mimicking Zelensky's statements and mimicking the statements of NATO and the EU. We're not quite sure what exactly Vucic aims to achieve from this, but through interaction with certain Serbian folks in the political commentator sphere, that it does seem like Vucic is bending to the whim of the EU and the powers that be, the WEF, the globalists, and some of the even more practical considerations that, hey, Serbia does need to join the European Union soon in order to gain any sort of benefits economically before the recession really hits and goes into overdrive. And it does seem like Kim Jong-un's sister actually supporting Russia in some ways rhetorically and in a soft sense more than Serbia has supported Russia. And I don't mean Serbia as the people, but it's Serbian political leadership. It does seem like there's a bit of a disconnect because North Korea is still a socialist and atheist nation in a way, but it does understand the current layout of the world, and the world is kind of going into this World War III stage, and of course North Korea needs to find its place. And will that place be with the United States? Obviously not. The United States has oppressed the North Korean people for decades now, essentially segregated the entire nation from the world and not allowed any interaction. So there is this kind of disconnect here, where we have on one hand this socialist atheist nation rising and claiming that yes, we do support the special military operation, we support Putin and the Russian people against NATO and the New World Order, and then you have Vucic, the leader of a Christian nation, which would love to probably say the same, and instead he falls and fails on that part, doesn't represent his people appropriately, and perhaps will be outed in the next election for this failure, in my opinion.
Well, it kind of shows you the power of, being forced to work outside of the system, whereas Serbia has always been destroyed so that it can be goaded into the system. I think it shows that now North Korea, for better or for worse, maybe you might think it's a CIA state like some, that's an opinion, but it seems to have more independence to decide its own foreign policy and relations in some ways than even Serbia does. So in that regard as well, we want to move towards, there's some stuff going on in Israel, and I believe this was recently said by the new ambassador to Israel to Germany, Ron Prosor, in an interview with WAZ Portal, which I believe is a German outlet of some kind. He says, Israel helps Ukraine, but behind the scenes and much more than is known, he claims. Which, again, Israel's position on the conflict has always been kind of wishy-washy. Sometimes they'll come out with pro-Ukraine statements, then become more neutral, then say they want help with negotiations. But it seems that especially a lot of these ambassadors to other countries are making it very clear that it seems very obvious that Mossad and the Israeli intelligence is probably helping the Ukrainians behind the scenes, especially in collaboration probably with the United States. And that's something that Russia, of course, is going to have to reckon with. If we've talked about in the past about its patronage of the Christians in the Holy Land. And this comes right after Putin has been seen, still fraternizing with like the top rabbis of Russia in this big display. He seems to be trying to still kind of win the support. But unfortunately, it just doesn't seem that that's going to be the final direction that, I don't know about unfortunately, but that's just not where Israel is going to go, especially as Russia solidifies its relationship with North Korea, Iran, these are Syria, who have truly come out in support, and Lukashenko, who he's kind of walked some of them back and said some again, but he's of course made controversial statements about Israel before. So it seems that Russia thinks that it can somehow walk these, because of its sheer power in the region, can balance it out with Israel, but I just don't think that's how some of this is going to go down.
Yeah, that's right. I remember Konstantin Dushenov, the famous Russian political YouTuber, on his channel is called Orthodox Russia, and he actually did mention the fact that Putin does have two chief rabbis around, and he uses them as essentially a private red telephone through which he can actually contact the elites in Israel and, kind of decide foreign political actions. And so he kind of does access Israel through this seemingly, not through the embassy, but through the religious rabbinical order that Israel has set up two particular rabbi chiefs in Russia, and Putin does speak to them, and he kind of passes on his messages, and in private, of course, and none of this really comes out to the press. All we see is Putin sitting at the table of two rabbis, but what exactly they'll be discussing behind closed doors outside, when the press isn't in the room, really isn't given to us. But yeah, Israel and Russian relations will come to heads essentially when Putin does confront the need for protecting Christians in the Holy Land. And he will need to explain to those rabbis, as well as some of the leaders of Israel, that, hey, look, if you guys will continue pressuring Christians, we will take this anti-American stance and implement and kind of, rightfully so, kind of push it onto yourselves, which are, you guys are the main allies of the United States, at least in a sense of the United States does provide an exorbitant amount of donations and military aid to Israel throughout the years, almost on a yearly basis, billions of dollars consistently. Israel is like the original Ukraine, propped up by American taxpayer dollars in a military sense. So Putin actually understanding that in Russia and hasn't really criticized that ever. So that is the kind of ace in Putin's hand here. He can always play that and say, look, Russia will begin tightening its relations with Israel if you guys don't meet our conditions on respecting Christians in Israel at the moment. But of course, the other big news from Israel is the terrorist act, the shooting at the synagogue, and we're still not sure who the perpetrator was. They're claiming it was a Palestinian extremist, maybe someone that has to do, someone related to Hamas. But these terrorist acts in the Holy Land, in Palestine, they do of course escalate matters over there, and of course give excuses not just to Hamas to of course escalate rhetoric, but also to the Israeli military, which I'm sure, as you guys have heard, me and Conrad have discussed this before, the Israeli military is always keen on kind of pushing its boundaries and, acting in domestic affairs.
Things in Palestine and Israel heating up in general. Hebrew media is now saying if it is proven that Gaza is behind the attack in Jerusalem, the army will launch a military operation against Gaza. And this, of course, is after, due to many expansions and new rushes of settlement to new, people will go out for a wedding somewhere in Palestine, and then a huge busload full of Jews will come and seize the house and occupy it and change the locks and everything. And as more of this goes on, the Palestinians have maybe hinted at a third intifada, which of course would be a big deal. And now, if the IDF is preparing for a full-on military operation against Gaza, that could be something that really triggers it from both Lebanon, parts of Syria, as well as, of course, the West Bank and Gaza itself. So we're going to be watching all of that very closely, obviously, as well as how it relates to the geopolitical situation in Ukraine and in Turkey. We have a big guest coming up next week. Not going to say who it is just yet. We'll announce it a bit later. But then later on, of course, we're going to keep covering things going on in Turkey. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the first analysis of our stuff with Haas. I'm going to let Dimitri say anything he wants before we send off, but we've kind of covered all we need to today.
Yeah, it's been quite a fruitful week in terms of discourse and actually exploring the Orthodox Christian worldview and kind of seeing it in contrast with Maga communism, this new ideology arising in the West, from some pretty notable figures on Twitter and as well as YouTube. So there is this debate you can go have a look at on the World War Now Twitter page. It is all recorded, so do have a listen, of course, with an open mind. Any questions you have, of course, provide them. And today, the analysis has looked at some of the events going on around the world, and as well as we appreciate Momcilo coming on and giving his perspective on communism from an Orthodox and geopolitical perspective as well, because communism around the world is still a potential, so it is, the fruits of communism, they are still with us today. The actions done by communist governments, the communist ideology has in some way shaped the world for better or for worse, and we mostly argue for the worst. In the 20th century, it has kind of given birth to this reality, which we now have to kind of digest, the fruits of which we have to live with. So there is that consideration, and overall it's been a pretty good week. So we'll see you guys in a few days' time.
Be sure to read Dimitri's article on pacifism. It'll be linked below as well. That's we're really getting these articles going out. This is a really good one. It's part of a series. I want to thank Momcilo. He's one of the most well-read guys I know. So if you need his credentials, you can listen. You can hear that right from me. He's a very smart guy. We'll hope to have him back. And yeah, be sure to also this week, Jay Dyer went on Dr. Steve Turley, which is a fantastic interview. I recommend everybody watch that. But with all of that being said, be sure to subscribe to us on Substack, worldwarnow.substack.com. Dimitri's article is up there. It's huge, all free. You'll want to read that it's really good content. I can promise you that. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, like this video. It really helps us. Leave a comment. Let us know what you think. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, World War Now _, Telegram, World War Now, TELE, Telly. And yeah, subscribe to the Substack. It's where most of our stuff is. We're really getting more stuff going here. Follow me on Twitter, GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. And yeah, we'll see you next time, and God bless.
God bless. Have a great week, guys.